The Montana wind howled like a wounded beast across the frozen prairie, carrying with it the scent of blood and the promise of death. Samuel Carter never expected that dragging a dying enemy warrior into his cabin would be the decision that saved not just one life, but an entire way of life. Sometimes the smallest acts of mercy echo the loudest across the vast wilderness, and sometimes your greatest enemy becomes your most unexpected ally. What happens when a simple farmer's compassion collides with ancient tribal warfare? Stay until the end to discover how one cup of water changed the course of two peoples forever. The blizzard struck Montana territory like the wrath of an angry god, transforming Samuel Carter's modest homestead into an island surrounded by a sea of white fury. Through the frost-covered window of his log cabin, Samuel watched the snow pile against his barn doors, each gust of wind threatening to tear the roof from its moorings. At 42, he had weathered many such storms, but this one felt different, more personal, more vengeful. Martha would have had the stew ready by now, he whispered to the empty cabin, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The memory of his wife's gentle humming as she worked in their tiny kitchen still haunted these walls, even though the fever had taken her 6 months ago. The cabin felt cavernous without her presence, every creak of the timbers echoing with loneliness. Samuel wrapped his worn buffalo coat tighter around his shoulders and checked the fire in the stone hearth. The flames danced weakly, consuming the last of his split oak. Tomorrow, if the storm passed, he'd need to venture to the woodshed. Tonight, he'd have to ration what remained. The wind suddenly shifted, carrying with it a sound that made Samuel's blood freeze, not the howl of the storm, but something else, something human. He pressed his ear against the wooden door, straining to distinguish between the natural chaos outside and what he thought he'd heard. There it was again, a low moan, barely audible above the tempest's roar. Samuel's hand moved instinctively to the Winchester rifle mounted above the fireplace. The tensions between the white settlers and the native tribes had been escalating for months. Just last week, news had reached their small community of Willow Creek about a Blackfoot war party attacking a supply wagon 20 miles north. The territorial governor had issued warnings about traveling alone, especially during the harsh winter months when desperation drove both man and beast to extreme measures. But that sound, it wasn't the war cry of an attacking warrior. It was the desperate plea of someone dying. Against every instinct screaming for caution, Samuel unlatched the heavy wooden door and stepped into the blizzard's embrace. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and immediately numbing his exposed skin. Snow whipped around him in violent spirals, reducing visibility to mere inches. "Hello?" he called out, his voice swallowed by the storm. "Is someone out there?" He followed the sound, each step sinking deep into the accumulated snow. The wind threatened to knock him off balance, but he pressed forward, guided by an inner compass of human decency that his late wife had always praised him for. There, collapsed against the corner of his barn, lay a figure nearly buried in snow. Samuel's heart hammered as he approached, uncertain whether he was walking toward friend or foe. The form was motionless except for the barely perceptible rise and fall of labored breathing. As Samuel brushed away the snow, his lantern light revealed the unconscious face of a Native American man, probably in his 20s, with strong, angular features marked by exhaustion and pain. Blood had frozen in dark streaks across his forehead, and his lips had turned an alarming shade of blue. Most telling were his clothes, traditional Crow garments now soaked through and offering no protection against the killing cold. Samuel knew enough about tribal distinctions to recognize the beadwork patterns and the style of the man's war shirt. The Crow had been longtime enemies of the Blackfoot, often serving as scouts for the U.S. Army, but politics and tribal affiliations meant nothing to a man dying in a blizzard. "Easy there, friend," Samuel murmured, though the warrior remained unconscious. "Let's get you somewhere warm." The journey back to the cabin became a test of Samuel's endurance. The warrior, though lean, was solid muscle and dead weight. Samuel half carried, half dragged him through the snow, pausing every few steps to catch his breath and fight off the disorientation that extreme cold brings. His lungs burned with each inhalation of the Arctic air, and his muscles screamed in protest. When they finally reached the cabin door, Samuel's strength nearly gave out. He managed to maneuver the unconscious man inside, immediately shutting out the storm's fury. The sudden warmth of the cabin's interior felt like a blessing, though Samuel knew the real work was just beginning. He laid the warrior on his own bed, the same bed where Martha had drawn her last breath, and began the careful process of removing the frozen garments. The man's skin was frighteningly pale, and Samuel could barely detect a pulse. Hypothermia had nearly claimed another victim of the unforgiving frontier. Samuel worked with the efficiency born of necessity, rubbing the warrior's limbs to restore circulation, wrapping him in every blanket he owned, and stoking the fire until the cabin glowed with warmth. He heated water in his largest pot and carefully spooned small amounts between the man's lips, watching for any sign of consciousness. As the hours passed and the storm continued its assault outside, Samuel found himself studying his unexpected guest. The warrior's face, now that color was returning to his features, bore the noble bearing Samuel had come to associate with the indigenous peoples of the territory. There was strength in the set of his jaw, intelligence in the high forehead, and something else, a sadness that seemed to run deeper than mere physical pain. Near dawn, as Samuel dozed fitfully in his wooden chair beside the bed, the warrior's eyes fluttered open. They were dark brown, almost black, and filled with confusion and wariness. The man tried to sit up, then groaned and fell back against the pillow. "Easy," Samuel said softly, leaning forward. "You're safe. You were dying in the storm." The warrior's eyes darted around the cabin, taking in his surroundings with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to danger. When his gaze returned to Samuel, there was a question in them that transcended language barriers. "Water," the warrior whispered, his voice barely audible. Samuel lifted a cup to the man's lips, supporting his head with gentle care. The warrior drank deeply, and some of the tension left his features. "My name is Samuel Carter," he said simply. "This is my home. You're welcome here until you're strong enough to travel." The warrior studied Samuel's face for a long moment, as if trying to understand why a white farmer would risk his safety for a stranger. Finally he spoke, his English accented but clear. "I am Windrunner of the Mountain Crow. Why do you help me, white man? Our peoples are not friends." Samuel considered the question seriously. Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken, though snow still fell steadily. Dawn was breaking somewhere beyond the grey clouds, bringing with it the promise of a new day and perhaps new challenges. "Because you're a man, and you were dying," Samuel replied. "Seems reason enough to me." Windrunner closed his eyes. Whether from exhaustion or contemplation, Samuel couldn't tell. But when he opened them again, there was something different in their depths, a spark of respect perhaps, or recognition of a kindness freely given without expectation of return. What Samuel didn't know, as he settled back into his chair to watch over his patient, was that somewhere in the swirling snow outside, a Blackfoot war party led by the legendary Chief Red Eagle had lost the trail of the Crow warrior they'd been hunting for 3 days. And come morning, that trail would lead them directly to Samuel Carter's door. The morning sun painted the snow-covered prairie in shades of gold and rose, creating a deceptive beauty that masked the brutal realities of frontier life. Samuel stood at his kitchen window, watching the last wisps of the storm clouds drift eastward like forgotten ghosts. The silence after the blizzard felt profound, almost sacred, broken only by the occasional crunch of settling snow and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Behind him, Windrunner sat propped against the headboard of the bed, his strength slowly returning with each passing hour. The warrior had spent much of the early morning in quiet contemplation, occasionally accepting spoonfuls of the thin broth Samuel had prepared from his dwindling food stores. Their conversation had been sparse but meaningful, two men from different worlds finding common ground in the simple rituals of survival and recovery. "The storm has passed," Samuel observed, not turning from the window. "Your people will be worried." Windrunner shifted uncomfortably, and Samuel caught the movement in the window's reflection. There was something the warrior wasn't telling him, a shadow that passed across his features whenever the topic of his people arose. "My people," Windrunner began, then stopped. He stared at his hands, noting the careful way Samuel had bandaged the cuts and scrapes he'd sustained during whatever ordeal had brought him to the farmer's door. "My people believe I am dead. Perhaps it is better that way." Samuel turned then, studying the young warrior's face. There was pain there that went deeper than physical injury, the kind of soul-deep hurt that came from betrayal or loss that cut to the very core of a man's identity. A man doesn't end up half frozen in a blizzard by accident, Samuel said gently. Not a warrior like you. Windrunner met his eyes, and in that moment, Samuel saw the weight of whatever burden the young man carried. The warrior was silent for a long time, as if deciding whether to trust this white farmer who had saved his life without asking for explanations or promises in return. I was returning from a peace mission, Windrunner finally said, his voice heavy with memory. The territorial governor sent word through the Indian agent that he wanted to meet with representatives from the Mountain Crow. He spoke of treaties, of land that would be ours forever, of food and supplies for the winter months. Samuel poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot that had been simmering on the stove. He offered some to Windrunner, who accepted it gratefully, wrapping his hands around the warm tin cup as if it were a lifeline. 3 of us went, Windrunner continued. Myself, my brother Blackhawk, and our cousin Standing Bear. We traveled for 4 days to reach the fort where the meeting was to take place. His voice grew bitter. When we arrived, we found soldiers and 3 Blackfoot warriors, including their war chief, Red Eagle. Samuel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Red Eagle was a name spoken in hushed tones throughout the territory, a Blackfoot leader renowned for his tactical brilliance and his fierce protection of his people's interests. The man was said to be honorable but unforgiving, and his war parties were feared from the Canadian border to the Yellowstone River. It was a trap, Samuel said, though he phrased it as a statement rather than a question. Windrunner nodded grimly. The governor had promised the same lands to both tribes, thinking to set us against each other, while the army moved in to claim what neither of us could hold. When Red Eagle and I realized what had been done, we understood that we had both been played for fools. The warrior paused to take a sip of coffee, and Samuel could see him reliving the events in his mind. Outside, a cardinal landed on the windowsill, its bright red plumage a stark contrast against the white snow, a splash of life and color in the austere winter landscape. My brother grew angry, Windrunner resumed. He accused Red Eagle of being part of the deception, of working with the soldiers to steal crow hunting grounds. Red Eagle's warriors took offense, and before anyone could stop it, weapons were drawn. Samuel closed his eyes, already anticipating the tragedy that was to follow. Blackhawk died with a Blackfoot lance in his chest, Windrunner said, his voice barely above a whisper. Standing Bear fell trying to protect him. I managed to escape during the fighting, but Red Eagle's warriors pursued me. For 3 days, I ran through territories I barely knew, staying ahead of them only because of the storm. The warrior set down his coffee cup and stared out the window at the pristine snow. They killed my family because of white man's lies, and now Red Eagle hunts me to preserve his honor. There can be no peace between us while I live. Samuel absorbed this information in silence. He understood now why Windrunner had seemed resigned to dying in the storm. Sometimes death felt easier than carrying the weight of such loss and the promise of endless conflict. Maybe that's not the only way this story ends, Samuel said after a long moment. Windrunner looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. You do not understand our ways, Samuel Carter. Blood calls for blood. Honor demands... Honor, Samuel interrupted gently, demands justice, not necessarily revenge. Before Windrunner could respond, both men heard it, the sound of horses approaching through the snow. Samuel moved quickly to the window and peered out through the frost-etched glass. His heart hammered as he counted the riders. 6 mounted warriors in traditional Blackfoot dress, their horses' breath steaming in the cold air as they approached the cabin at a deliberate pace. They found your trail, Samuel said simply. Windrunner struggled to stand, his hand instinctively reaching for weapons that were no longer there. Samuel had removed the warrior's knife and tomahawk while treating his injuries, and they now lay on the kitchen table alongside his other personal effects. Give me my weapons, Windrunner said, his voice steady despite the impossible odds he faced. I will not hide behind your kindness, Samuel Carter. These men have come for me, and I will meet them with honor. Samuel looked at the young warrior, barely more than a boy really despite his strength and courage, and made a decision that surprised them both. No, he said firmly. This is my home, and you're my guest. Nobody takes a man from Samuel Carter's table while he's still recovering from injury. Windrunner stared at him in amazement. You would fight Red Eagle's warriors for a stranger? A Crow warrior you met only hours ago? Samuel moved to the gun rack and took down his Winchester, checking the action with practiced efficiency. "I'd fight them for any man who was my guest," he replied. "That's what civilized people do." Outside, the Blackfoot warriors had formed a semicircle around the cabin, their positioning tactical and professional. Samuel could see that they weren't preparing for an immediate assault. They were waiting, perhaps giving him a chance to surrender their quarry without bloodshed. A single rider separated from the group and approached the cabin door. Even from a distance, Samuel could see that this man carried himself differently from the others, with the natural authority of a leader and the measured confidence of someone accustomed to having his commands obeyed without question. "That is Red Eagle," Windrunner said, his voice filled with a mixture of respect and resignation. "He is said to be a man of honor, but he will not leave without me." Samuel looked from Windrunner to the approaching chief, then back again. An idea began to form in his mind. Risky, perhaps even foolish, but based on what he'd learned about both men during this extraordinary morning. "Maybe," Samuel said slowly, "it's time someone told the truth about what really happened at that fort." Red Eagle dismounted 20 feet from the cabin door and approached on foot, his hands visible and empty of weapons, a gesture of peaceful intent, though Samuel noticed the chief's warriors remained mounted and ready. When Red Eagle stopped just outside the door, he called out in accented but clearly understandable English, "I am Red Eagle of the Blackfoot Nation. I know the Crow warrior Windrunner shelters in your house, white man. Send him out, and no harm will come to you." Samuel stepped out onto his small porch, his rifle held in a non-threatening position but readily available. The morning air bit at his exposed skin, but he stood straight and met the legendary war chief's gaze without flinching. "Good morning, Chief Red Eagle," Samuel said politely. "I'm Samuel Carter, and this is my home. The man inside is my guest, and he's still recovering from injuries. Surely a great chief like yourself understands the laws of hospitality." Red Eagle studied Samuel with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to measure not just his words but his character. The chief was younger than Samuel had expected, probably in his early 30s, with the bearing of a man who had earned his position through capability rather than birthright. "You risk much for a stranger, farmer," Red Eagle said. "Windrunner and his brothers killed 3 of my warriors at the fort. Honor demands justice." "And what if I told you," Samuel replied carefully, "that there might be more to that story than you know?" Something in Samuel's tone must have intrigued the chief, because Red Eagle's expression shifted subtly. Instead of the impatience Samuel had expected, he saw curiosity and perhaps even a willingness to listen. Inside the cabin, Windrunner had managed to stand and make his way to the window. Samuel could feel the young warrior's presence behind him, and he hoped that what he was about to propose wouldn't get them all killed. "I suggest," Samuel continued, "that we all step inside where it's warm and let the truth be told in its entirety. What happened at that fort affects all of us who call this territory home." Red Eagle considered this for a long moment, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Finally, he nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "Very well, Samuel Carter. We will hear this truth you speak of. But know this, if treachery is revealed, honor will still demand its price." As the Blackfoot chief gestured for his warriors to stand down, Samuel realized that the next few minutes would determine not just Windrunner's fate, but possibly the future of peace in the entire territory. Sometimes, he reflected, the smallest acts of hospitality open doors to the largest possibilities. The weight of honor, it seemed, could be shared rather than fought over. Now he just had to convince 2 proud warriors that their real enemy wasn't each other. The interior of Samuel's modest cabin had never hosted such a gathering. Red Eagle stood near the doorway, his imposing presence filling the small space with an energy that seemed to make the very walls contract. His warriors remained outside, positioned strategically but no longer with the immediate readiness for violence that had marked their arrival. Windrunner sat on the edge of the bed, his color improved, but his posture still betraying the weakness that comes from exposure and injury. Samuel moved between them, like a man walking on thin ice, aware that one wrong word could shatter the fragile truce he'd managed to broker. He poured coffee into 3 cups, the mundane domestic act serving to ground the extraordinary tension that filled the room. "Before anyone speaks of justice or honor," Samuel began, offering a cup to Red Eagle, "I think we should start with what really happened at Fort Benton. Not the version the soldiers will report, Not the story that serves anyone's political interests, but the truth. Red Eagle accepted the coffee but didn't drink, his eyes never leaving Windrunner's face. I know what happened, farmer. 3 Crow warriors came to steal land that belongs to my people. When they were confronted with their deception, they chose violence over honesty. That's not what happened, Windrunner said quietly, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. And in your heart, Red Eagle, you know it. The Blackfoot chief's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. Windrunner struggled to his feet, using the bedpost for support. Despite his weakened condition, there was dignity in his bearing that commanded respect. Tell me, Great Chief, what did Governor Mitchell promise your people when he invited you to that meeting? Land rights to the valley, between the 2 Medicine River and Cut Bank Creek, Red Eagle replied without hesitation. Hunting grounds that have belonged to the Blackfoot since our grandfathers' grandfathers walked this earth. The same valley he promised to the Mountain Crow, Windrunner said. The same hunting grounds he told us would be ours in perpetuity, protected by treaty and guaranteed by the territorial government. Samuel watched Red Eagle's expression change subtly. The chief was intelligent enough to see where this was leading, but his pride demanded that he hear it stated explicitly. You're saying we were both deceived, Red Eagle said slowly. I'm saying Governor Mitchell never intended either tribe to keep that land, Windrunner replied. When I saw you at the fort, when I realized you'd been promised the same territory, I knew we'd been played against each other. Your warriors and mine died because a white politician wanted to clear the valley for railroad speculation. Red Eagle set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. Samuel could see the war chief's mind working, processing not just Windrunner's words, but the implications of what they meant for both tribes. You knew this, Red Eagle said, yet your brother drew his weapon against my warriors. Pain flickered across Windrunner's features. Black Hawk was young and proud. When your warrior accused him of being a liar and a thief, he couldn't bear the insult. He didn't understand that we were all victims of the same deception. And you said nothing to prevent the bloodshed. Windrunner's hands clenched into fists. I tried. I called out that we'd been deceived, that neither of us was the enemy. But by then the anger had grown too hot. Steel was drawn, and you know how quickly such things escalate. Samuel had been listening carefully, and now he stepped forward. Chief Red Eagle, may I ask you something? The Blackfoot leader nodded curtly. When the fighting started, where were the soldiers? Red Eagle's eyes narrowed as he considered the question. They withdrew, said they didn't want to interfere in tribal disputes. How convenient, Samuel observed. They arranged for 2 tribal leaders to meet over land rights, then stepped aside when violence erupted, almost as if they expected it to happen. The implications hung heavy in the air. Red Eagle was silent for a long moment, his warrior's mind analyzing the tactical situation from a new perspective. You believe this was their intention from the beginning, he said finally. I believe, Samuel replied carefully, that Governor Mitchell wanted an excuse to declare both tribes hostile. Nothing gives the territorial government more justification for seizing native lands than a savage uprising that threatens white settlers. Windrunner nodded weakly. After the fighting, what did the soldiers do? Red Eagle's expression darkened. They sent word to the territorial capital that both tribes had broken faith, that the peace negotiations had failed due to Indian aggression. While you hunted me through the wilderness, proving their point about savage behavior, Windrunner added, and while my people mourned their dead and prepared for war, also proving their point. The silence that followed was profound. Samuel could almost see the pieces clicking into place in Red Eagle's mind, the carefully orchestrated meeting, the convenient withdrawal of soldiers, the inflammatory language that had sparked the violence. My warriors died for nothing, Red Eagle said, his voice heavy with the weight of realization. As did my brother and cousin, Windrunner replied, but their deaths don't have to be meaningless if we choose to see the real enemy clearly. Red Eagle began pacing the small confines of the cabin, his movements those of a caged predator. Samuel recognized the signs of a man whose entire worldview was shifting, whose assumptions about honor and justice were being challenged by uncomfortable truths. Even if what you say is true, Red Eagle said eventually, blood has been spilled. My warriors' families cry for vengeance. Your people prepare for war. How does knowledge of deception heal such wounds? Windrunner looked directly into the chief's eyes. It doesn't heal them, but it redirects them toward the real enemy. Samuel sensed that this was the crucial moment, the fulcrum on which everything would balance. He chose his words carefully. "Chief Red Eagle, you're known throughout the territory as a man of wisdom and honor. Windrunner spoke of you with respect even when he believed you were his enemy. What if, instead of continuing a war based on lies, you both chose to expose the truth?" "What are you suggesting, Farmer?" Red Eagle asked. "I'm suggesting that two great leaders working together could accomplish what neither could achieve alone. Governor Mitchell counted on your mutual destruction. What if you gave him your mutual cooperation instead?" Red Eagle stopped pacing and stared at Samuel with new interest. "You speak of alliance between traditional enemies. I speak of alliance between men who've been wronged by the same enemy," Samuel corrected. "Your people and Windrunner's people both love this land. You both want to protect your families and preserve your ways of life. The territorial government wants to take that away from all of you." Windrunner struggled to stand fully upright, his strength returning with his sense of purpose. "Red Eagle, I propose something that has never been done before. Let the Blackfoot and the Mountain Crow stand together against those who would steal from both of us." "You would trust me with your people's lives?" Red Eagle asked. "I would trust you with my own life," Windrunner replied simply, "as I have already done by speaking these words in your presence." The Blackfoot chief considered this for a long moment. Samuel could see the internal struggle between traditional thinking and necessary adaptation, between the comfort of familiar enemies and the risk of untested alliances. "There would be conditions," Red Eagle said finally. "Name them." "The families of my fallen warriors must be compensated according to Blackfoot law. Your people must acknowledge their grief and loss." Windrunner nodded without hesitation. "And the families of my brother and cousin must receive the same recognition from your people." "Agreed. We will mourn each other's dead as our own." Samuel felt a shift in the room's atmosphere, as if something fundamental had changed in the space between heartbeats. These two men, representatives of peoples who had been enemies for generations, were forging something entirely new. "There's more," Red Eagle continued. "If we are to stand together against the territorial government, we must present a united front. No more raids against each other's hunting parties, no more cattle stealing or horse theft." "Agreed," Windrunner said. "And we share information about troop movements, about government plans that affect either of our peoples." And Red Eagle added with a slight smile, "We make Governor Mitchell very, very uncomfortable." The sound that escaped Windrunner was part laugh, part cough, but entirely genuine. "I think Samuel Carter's hospitality may have just changed the history of the Montana Territory." Samuel refilled their coffee cups, marveling at what he'd witnessed. Two men who had entered his cabin as mortal enemies were leaving as allies, united by truth and forged by shared purpose. "There's one more thing," Windrunner said as he accepted his cup. "We'll need proof of the government's deception, something that can't be denied or explained away." Red Eagle's eyes gleamed with the light of a man who had found his prey. "Leave that to me. I know where Governor Mitchell keeps his private correspondence, and I know people who can read the white man's writing better than he can read our intentions." As the morning sun climbed higher over the snow-covered prairie, Samuel realized that his simple act of mercy the night before had set in motion events that would ripple far beyond his small homestead. Sometimes, he reflected, the most profound changes begin with the smallest gestures of human decency. But he also knew that the real test of this newfound alliance would come when Red Eagle and Windrunner had to convince their peoples that their greatest enemy wore a suit and tie, not war paint and feathers. The hardest battles, Samuel had learned, were often fought not against strangers but against one's own assumptions about who deserved trust and who deserved blame. Outside, Red Eagle's warriors waited patiently for their chief's return, unaware that the man who emerged from the cabin would be leading them into an entirely different kind of war. 3 weeks later, the great council fire burned bright against the early spring twilight, its flames reaching toward a sky painted in shades of amber and rose. The gathering erupted in a chorus of war cries, not the sounds of individual tribes preparing for battle, but the unified voice of a people who had found common cause. Samuel felt the hair on his arms rise as the sound echoed across the prairie, carrying with it the promise of change that could reshape the entire territory. As the celebration continued around the fire, Samuel noticed a rider approaching from the east, his horse lathered with sweat despite the cool evening air. The messenger, one of Red Eagle's scouts, dismounted and hurried to his chief's side, whispering urgently in his ear. Red Eagle's expression darkened as he listened. Then he raised his hand for silence. The gathering quieted immediately, sensing the gravity of whatever news had arrived. "Governor Mitchell has learned of our alliance," Red Eagle announced. "He has petitioned the territorial commander for federal troops, claiming that Blackfoot and Crow war parties are planning coordinated attacks on white settlements." "How could he know?" Windrunner demanded. "Because," Samuel said grimly, "he never intended to let any of us live long enough to expose his crimes." The messenger stepped forward, still breathing hard from his urgent ride. "There is more, Chief. The governor has issued warrants for the arrest of Windrunner and yourself, claiming you are the leaders of a hostile confederation. The bounty on your heads is $500 each, dead or alive." Samuel felt his blood run cold. $500 was more money than most frontier residents saw in 5 years. Every bounty hunter, desperate drifter, and opportunistic settler in the territory would be hunting his friends within days. "Then we move faster than he expects," Windrunner said with calm determination. "How long before the federal troops arrive?" 2 weeks, maybe 3 if the weather turns bad," the messenger replied. Red Eagle stood and began pacing around the fire, his mind clearly working through tactical possibilities. "Not enough time for a legal challenge. Judge Harrison is in Denver for the winter court session. But enough time for something else," Samuel said, an idea forming in his mind. "What if instead of hiding from the bounty hunters, we gave them exactly what they're looking for?" Both chiefs stared at him with expressions that suggested he might have taken leave of his senses. "Hear me out," Samuel continued. "Mitchell is counting on us either running or fighting scattered actions that he can crush piecemeal. What if we do neither?" "Speak plainly, friend," Grey Wolf said with the bluntness of age. "What if we surrender?" The silence that followed was so complete that Samuel could hear the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of a coyote miles away on the prairie. "You want us to walk into his trap?" Swift Arrow asked incredulously. "I want us to spring a trap of our own," Samuel replied. "Mitchell's plan only works if he can portray you as savage enemies of civilization. But what happens to that narrative if 2 respected tribal leaders voluntarily surrender themselves to face justice, demanding a public trial where they can present evidence of government corruption?" Windrunner's eyes lit with understanding. "The white man's own sense of fair play becomes our weapon." "Exactly. Mitchell can execute dangerous war criminals in secret, but he can't execute prisoners who have surrendered peacefully without making himself look like a tyrant. Especially not if the territorial newspapers are watching." Red Eagle stopped pacing and stared at Samuel with something approaching awe. "You're suggesting we bet our lives on the white man's conscience." "I'm suggesting we bet our lives on the fact that not all white men are like Governor Mitchell," Samuel corrected. "There are decent people in positions of power, people who actually believe in justice. We just have to force them to choose sides publicly." The 2 chiefs exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them that spoke of shared risk and mutual trust. Samuel realized he was witnessing the final cementing of an alliance that had begun with a dying man in a blizzard. "There would be conditions," Windrunner said finally. "Name them." "We surrender together publicly, in front of witnesses. We demand a joint trial where we can present our evidence. And we make it clear that if we disappear or die under suspicious circumstances, our people will assume Mitchell ordered our murders. And," Red Eagle added, "Samuel Carter comes with us as our witness and advocate. You started this, Farmer. You should see it through to the end." Samuel felt his heart skip a beat. He had hoped to remain safely in the background while others took the dangerous risks. But looking around the circle at the faces of men who were willing to bet their lives on his plan, he knew he couldn't ask them to show courage he wasn't willing to demonstrate himself. "I'll come," he said simply. Grey Wolf rose from his seat by the fire and approached Samuel, placing weathered hands on the farmer's shoulders. "Martha Carter raised a good man," he said softly. "She would be proud." Samuel's eyes misted at the unexpected tribute to his late wife. These warriors had never met Martha, but they understood that the compassion she had nurtured in him was what had made this moment possible. As the council fire burned lower and the spring stars emerged overhead, the assembled warriors began making their preparations. Some would return to their tribes to explain what was happening and why. Others would shadow the surrender party at a distance, ready to bear witness to whatever transpired. A few would remain behind to care for families and protect the camps, but all understood that they were participating in something that would be remembered long after the last of them had joined their ancestors. The story of the Blackfoot chief and the Crow warrior who chose trust over hatred, and the white farmer who proved that mercy could change the world. 3 days later, Samuel Carter rode toward the territorial capital, flanked by Red Eagle and Windrunner, their small party trailed by a growing crowd of curious settlers, newspaper reporters, and federal marshals. Word of the unprecedented surrender had spread like wildfire across the territory, drawing attention from as far away as Denver and Chicago. Governor Mitchell waited for them in his office, confident that he was about to eliminate the final obstacles to his railroad fortune. What he didn't expect was that the men coming to surrender would be carrying with them the means of his own destruction and the will to use it. The morning sun climbed higher over the Montana prairie, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and promise. And in a modest cabin miles away, the embers of a fire that had warmed a dying warrior still glowed softly, a reminder that the smallest acts of human kindness could indeed echo across the vast wilderness, changing the course of history itself. Sometimes the greatest victories begin not with the clash of weapons, but with the offering of a cup of water to a stranger in need. And sometimes the truest measure of a man's character is found not in how he treats his friends, but in how he treats his enemies when they are helpless and dying in the snow. The alliance forged in Samuel Carter's cabin would reshape the Montana territory, but its true legacy would be the proof that even in the harshest wilderness, compassion could triumph over hatred, and mercy could indeed change the world, one small gesture of human decency at a time.